Let me remind you again, blood safety quiz today at the beginning of the lab. All right, you gotta make an 80% to pass, and again, you're using the list from the lab packet. Okay? So the way it'll work is we'll do the quiz. I'm gonna talk to you about endocrine system, and then you can be dealing with that, and I'm gonna look at the quizzes. If you passed, I tell you. If not, then I will tell you as well. And then you'll need to make an arrangement to take the quiz again to pass it. And if you don't pass it the second time, you get one more time. That's all. And it won't be today. Also, when you take the blood safety quiz, whatever score you get first shot, that's what counts. So if you don't pass it and you take it again, you get a passing score instead of your first grade is what counts. All right, so anyway, that's happening here in a little bit, and then we're planning on doing the blood lab itself on Wednesday. All right, now, otherwise, yesterday we kind of started talking about the spinal cord. So the first thing is, again, in terms of basic function right here, the cord really is the connection for most of our peripheral nerves, meaning the spinal nerves as they come in and out here of the cord. Again, one pair per junction of vertebrae. We also have with the cord conduction up to the brain and back down from the brain. So again, sensory would go up here and then motor back here. And then the third thing that happens with the cord is that we do have these autonomic centers characterized as reflex centers that allow you to kind of respond to things very, very quickly. Some of this you barely recognize when it happens. You're aware of it afterwards. Some of these also involved in your autonomic responses, like, for instance, heart rate, for instance. Okay? So anyway, that's our basic functions right there. I was mentioning about the meninges. Again, we've got a dura mater right here. At this point, arachnoid just on the inside face of it. Pia, again, on the surface of the cord, just like it is on the surface of the brain. And then we have this space between the arachnoid mater, pia mater, called the subarachnoid space. And again, it holds the cerebrospinal fluid. The thing we have in the spinal meninges associated with them that we don't have in the brain, first of all, is the fact that the dura itself is only one layer thick, whereas I did say it was two layers in the brain. That's why we have septa and sulcus, sinus kind of things. And then the other thing is not attached to bone, the dura. And the reason it's not attached to bone is because we do have this additional space right here between the dura and the vertebrae, and that's called the epidural space, so outside of the dura mater. All right, so anyway, I think that's where we were the other day. So today we're going to talk about the basic structure of the cord. We already looked at this in lab already, so we're kind of catching up to lab a little bit today. And then we'll talk about a little bit about reflexes. And then we're going to move on to the autonomic nervous system. Now, first thing about the spinal cord, it is solid from the brainstem, the medulla, down to about the first lumbar vertebrae or so. And so represented here by the solid yellow color, we've got the end point here called the conus medullaris. That's basically the most inferior solid aspect of the cord. And then the spinal nerves continue on down through the vertebrae down toward the bottom. And this array of spinal nerves is just kind of a bunch of parallel nerve tracks together, called the cauda equina. We also have two enlargements. One up in the neck region called the cervical enlargement, and that's where you basically give rise to nerves coming in and out of the shoulders and the neck, and muscles up in there down into the arms. And you can see it's kind of enlarged right here relative to above and below it. And then we do have a second enlargement called the lumbar enlargement or sacral enlargement down here at the base of the solid part of the cord. So this gives rise to a lot of things that go into the lower abdominal cavity, as well as other structures right there and muscles. This is the one that does not show in the lab because the vertebrae are actually in the position, so you don't see it. All right, so the thing about the nerves, again, 31 pairs of spinal nerves, and they begin up at the junction between C1 first, cervical and the skull. And then they just, of course, continue all the way down here to the bottom. Again, showing them on the one side here, but obviously we do have a similar appearance, exact appearance actually, on the other side. Serve all areas of the body except head and neck. Remember, cranial nerves serve the head and the neck directly. And they're mixed, which means you've got both a sensory and a motor component associated with each one. And so the nerve here, for instance, we use that one right there, again would have sensory going out and coming back in from the body from a location, and then the motor would go back out, follow the same nerve out to the muscles in that same location as the receptor. So they're running, you know, parallel to each other, but they're running in opposite directions. And so here at the entrance into the vertebrae and the cord, again, we're just illustrating that the sensory is coming in here, motor out here, and as we continue on, that's a mixed nerve containing both sensory and motor. Now, we kind of talked in lab about how the sensory splits from the motor once we get inside of the vertebrae. And so you kind of tell the difference between the back side, front side, by the position of this enlargement right here. And that's called the posterior sensory ganglia. And so as the sensory comes in, we do have these very specific types of neurons called unipolar neurons, which basically means that the dendrites are up here on this end. Then we come down here and our axons down here. And the cell body kind of sits off here on the side. This is called unipolar, or a type of a neuron, and it's only associated with sensory nerves. So where that ganglia is where all of the cell bodies associated with that particular sensory array of nerves coming in are located. And so they're showing one right here, but there would be really hundreds and hundreds of sensory neuron cell bodies all sitting in there. And again, that enlargement is characterized as a ganglia. Pretty similar to what we talked about as a nucleus in the You don't lay down. You can lay down outside, please. Right? So anyway, it's the cell bodies, right? And so it's a collection of cell bodies. And again, you get that enlargement right there. And then from this sensory ganglia right here, then we've got a little bit of fiber that is called the sensory root, and that actually directs the sensory information out into the cord. As we come out on the front right here, we've got our anterior motor root. So this is the signals coming out of the cord, heading out to the body. Again, going to follow the same path as the sensory coming in, because they're all coming from the same and going to the same location. But notice again, no enlargement right here, because the cell body for the sensory, the motor neurons up in the cord, actually. And that's just all basically axon. So when you look at the model in the lab for the cord with the vertebrae, it does have the little bone parts, and you can see the little spinous process is the back. But when you look at the model of the cord without the bone, you've got to be able to recognize this enlargement, because that indicates the back side of the cord, the sensory side. So again, sensory, posterior sensory ganglia, posterior sensory root, which are the connection. As we come out on the front, anterior motor root, no ganglia. Okay. This is just a micrograph showing that all of these little spots in there represent the cell bodies of sensory neurons. And again, they're all shaped like this. They're all laying in one group right here within that ganglia. And this is the only place that you have, again, the unipolar type of neurons. All right, now once we go into the cord, we've got gray matter, white matter, like we talked about with the brain. And so on the cord, though, the white matter is on the outside, gray matter is on the inside. Remember, white matter means myelinated, axon tracts, nerve tracts, whereas the Gray matter means unmyelinated, and it's mostly cell bodies. There's some nerve tract too, but it's mostly neuron cell bodies. And the gray itself, remember, connected across the midline here by this little narrow bridge of gray material called the gray chromosaur. And the little hole here in the center is the central canal. And that runs, of course, the length of the cord, and that delivers cerebrospinal fluid throughout the interior of the cord. So, again, white matter on the outside, gray matter on the inside. Now, the gray is divided up into what we call gray horns, all right? And so the gray horns are characterized as posterior on the back of the cord, anterior on the front, and then on the side, lateral. And so we're illustrating right here that this is our ganglion, that's the posterior sensory root. So that region here of the gray matter is just characterized as the posterior gray horn. That's where your sensory information does come in. When we come out on the motor side, these cell bodies for these motor neurons are actually in the gray matter, but on the front they're in the so-called anterior horns, and then they extend out. And again, this is really just the axons now that are following out. And then we also have a region along the thoracic part where we do have this lateral gray horn, really only in the thoracic, and we'll talk about this with the autonomic in particular, but that's where nerves come out related to the sympathetic nervous system. So anyway, you just characterize the parts of the gray, posterior, lateral, anterior, according to the part of the cord that they are located on. Now, for the white matter, the myelinated tract characterized as columns. Okay? And again, a posterior, lateral, and anterior set of columns. We show here in blue the sensory, which means now we're going from the cord back up toward the brain. In red, the motor, so we're running down from the brain down toward the cord to where it's going to go out. So the region here in the very back characterized as the posterior white columns. Again, our sensory is coming in right here, so the tract's leading to the brain basically right there next to it. We have over here on the side lateral white columns, which you can see there's kind of an array of both the sensory and motor running there. And then here on the front part, where again just your anterior fiber comes out, we do have again the sensory and motor, but again the white matter tracts are just characterized as columns. And so sensory means we're going from somewhere in the body or the cord back up to the brain. Motor means we're going from the brain back down toward the cord and ultimately out toward the body. So again, just kind of positioning the parts of the cord according to whether it's posterior, anterior, or lateral. And it's the same for both the white and the gray. It's just that the white is characterized as a column, whereas the gray is characterized as horns. And you see other references to the tract names, which are important for us in here. Here's an example of a sensory tract, spinothalamic. So that means it's going from the spinal cord up to the thalamus. So we have our input coming in on this side. Again, here's our posterior sensory ganglia. Here's the roots. We come in here to the cord, and they're showing that we have a synapse here within the cord with our next neuron. Notice that we do jump the midline right here, because remember, everything's contralateral. So anything coming from this side here is going to be interpreted on the other side. And then this nerve runs from the spinal cord up to the thalamus, okay, for the spinal thalamic reference. Remember, all the sensory goes through the thalamus first, and it kind of sorts it out and decides what the information is about, where it's coming from, how intense it is. And then we have a neuron that leads from the thalamus up to the appropriate region in the cortex that's going to interpret that signal coming from wherever these receptors are located in the body. So again, spinal cord to thalamus. So that's an indication that we're going up the cord to the brain. So that's an example of a sensory type of tract. Okay, same thing right here, other than to say that as the sensory comes in, it stays on the same side, then jumps up over here across the midline, in this case in the medulla. Again, still to the thalamus, and then ultimately to the interpretation region in the cortex. All right, and then this is to illustrate that you, of course, can detect two different sensations at the same time, because as they get rooted up through the thalamus, because they're coming from different places in the body, and they're different kind of receptors, there's different areas in the brain that can interpret them at the same time. So we're illustrating right here that we've got some kind of a touch receptor. You can't see a little feather right there, just kind of like delicately brushing there, just give light touch. At the same time, we of course got joint kind of receptors sort of relating to joint position. All of those go up to the brain and through the thalamus, but notice one of them goes here, one of them goes over there. Different interpretation regions. Over here on this side right here, we're showing pain receptors. So we've got kind of the hot foot going on down here at your foot with a lit match. We've got actually up here cutting your finger with the razor blade. Again, detecting those two different kind of sensations at the same time, because ultimately, again, they do end up two different locations. Pretty much basically coming from the same spot for both of them, but of course, the nature of the reception right here and what's going on, the stimulus versus right here, of course, is completely different. And we obviously do interpret lots and lots of different sensations at the same time. Now, this is going to be motor, so now we're starting up at the cortex and we're going down through the cord and out to the body. This happens to be the cortical spinal tract I was talking about the other day. So cortical is a reference to coming from the cortex, going down to the spinal cord. This is the one that we have this so-called cerebral peduncle kind of bulge on the underside of the midbrain, because again, the fibers kind of run on the lower surface. Again, we have this cross point in the medulla called the decussation of the pyramid, also associated with this particular tract. And again, this is where the bulk of the fibers cross from one midline to the other. The ones that stay on the same side ultimately do bounce to the other side once they get down to the point where they're going to leave the cord. So this is motor, that's starting at the cortex, going down to the spinal cord, and then ultimately out to the body. So cortical spinal. And then same thing here, just showing two at one time. So this is really the one I just showed you right here, cortical spinal. And then another one, cerebrospinal, which I've never asked you about, but again, it just starts with this thing called the red nucleus and heads down to the spinal cord. So anyway, examples of tracts. And then the term commissural just means they jump across the midline. And that's what the gray commissural tracts are about. They leave the gray matter on the one side to the gray matter on the other side, and vice versa. Okay? So again, right across this way to this way, this way to this way. So commissural just means they go across the midline. All right, so those are some examples of nerve tracts, ascending, descending, and again, the ascending, descending tracts themselves are within that white matter. Okay, white matter. All right, now the next thing is that, we've kind of talked about the spinal nerve from this part, this direction, and again, said that it is mixed as we go out, but there's actually three branches of the spinal nerve. And these branches are called rami. And so rami or ramus just means, again, a branch. So the first branch is characterized as the ventral ramus, or branch. The second one is called the dorsal ramus, or branch. And then the third one is called the rami communicantes. Okay, and so these are the three branches. So this one coming here, continuing off to the body, that's the ventral ramus. It is the physically largest of the three branches. This one right here that is a little smaller that you can see kind of coming out and going around to the back muscle right here is the dorsal or posterior, basically serves the back muscle. where it does emerge from the cord. Okay, and so, again, it's just really serving the muscle right here at the junction where it comes out of the cord. And then the third branch, which is illustrated by this part right through here, is the part that's related or associated with the autonomic nervous system. And so we'll talk about this briefly when we talk about the ANS. And particularly, it's associated with the sympathetic part of your autonomic nervous system. So this one right here is just right here. This one right here is up right there, but this is the one that goes out to the body. And this is the one that's going to actually form all of your nerve networks in the body. And this is also the one that's going to form these kind of interconnected series of spinal nerves that are called the spinal plexus groups. Plexus is where you just have a bunch of nerves that come out like in your neck or in your arms that all kind of merge together before they go off into the appropriate structure in the body. Okay? So, all related to the ventral ramus. On this side right here, here's the ventral, there's the dorsal, there's the rami, and then as we come a little bit further this way, that's where we see our spinal plexus groups. So, we're showing here on this one these interconnected nerves up here, so they're just kind of, vertically connecting to each other. Another series right in here, none through the thoracic rib cage region, and then we have again another plexus interaction down here, interconnection, and then a fourth one down here on the bottom. So the thing about the plexus, again, basically an interconnected array of ventral branches or ventral rami. So we've got one in the neck called the cervical plexus. We've got one immediately below that called the brachial plexus. And then we have one down below the ribs. There's a lumbar grouping. And then we have one all the way down at the bottom, sacral plexus. And again, these are where the nerves themselves, as they come out, they interconnect vertically with each other. So again, the cervical ones are here in the neck. The ones immediately below it are brachial, and they're going to go down into the arm right here. Then we have no plexus through the rib region, thoracic region, but then we pick up again with another plexus down here near the bottom, lumbar plexus, and then the one all the way down at the very bottom here, sacral. Lumbar plexus give rise to nerves that come off into the lower abdominal cavity, pelvic cavity, as well as down into the legs. The ones from the sacrum mostly going down into the legs. So that's interconnected spinal nerves. And again, these right here are in the neck. Again, the ones that are brachial are in the arm. Again, the one here for lumbar. Again, lower abdominal. Plus the legs, to some extent, sacral into the legs. Okay? And so in the lab, when I talked about knowing the radial medial ulnar nerve across the lower arm, they're really derived from the nerves in the brachial plexus. When I talked about the femoral nerve going down into the leg, that actually comes out of the lumbar plexus. When I talked about the sciatic nerve comes out of the sacral plexus, and again extends off into these regions. Now, the area here within the thoracic region, there are no plexus groupings. And so the nerves in the thoracic region these are characterized as intercostal nerves. So these right here have no kind of plexus type of structure. So they just come out singly, like they're showing right there, kind of run between the ribs, serve the area here of the thoracic wall individually, but they're not vertically connected between each other. So, thing is all of the plexus groups are derived from the ventral ramus structure, okay? Dorsal just kind of serves the body where they come out. Ramus communicanti related to our other system we'll talk about. Again, they're interconnected. So there's about 4 or 5 or so here in the neck called the cervical. There's the lower cervical and the kind of upper first 2 or so of the thoracic do the brachial, run down into the arm, lumbar, down below the rib cage. Again, lower abdominal, and the femoral goes into the leg. Sacral plexus down at the very bottom, coming down the sacral part of the cord. Again, interconnected, runs down into the legs. But again, with the rib cage, the thoracic region, we have again what are called intercostal, because they do extend between the ribs. And so just illustrating here what they would look like. So here we come out with our nerve. You can see they kind of branch to kind of an inner and an outer set of nerves, but they're not like going vertically. It's still within the same plane. Okay? And so again, serving the muscle here where between the ribs. So again, with the thoracic region, these so-called intercostal nerves just mean there's no plexus, no linking structure right there. All right, so everybody see that okay? Just step this forward. All right, so with that, let's talk a few minutes about these reflexes. All right, now reflexes are rapid responses to change. They are basically things that kind of happen subconsciously, no conscious kind of control. You tend to be aware of them after the fact, in some cases, not absolutely always. They're not learned at all. It's just an innate kind of way to respond to things going on in the body. So, what we have here to start with, in the sense of this, is just basically back to our idea of the homeostatic feedback loop. So, you've got, again, the receptor up here in the skin, which in this case showing a pain receptor because of the pin sticking in, sensory afferent neuron coming back to the cord, integration in the CNS, integration neuron right there. And then we have our motor efferent neuron running out to the body. Here's our effector, which again, skeletal muscle, in this case right here. And then the effector carries out the response, which obviously with something like this will be to reach over and pull that pin out, right, of your skin. Okay? So, again, same thing we talked about before with the idea of, again, just homeostatic feedback loop, the functions of the CNS, and so on. Now, the thing about the reflexes, all right? So there are 3 ways that we characterize the reflex. The first one has to do with the number of synapses. So a monosynaptic reflex is going to have just 1 synapse. And so this means that your sensory neuron is going to synapse directly with the motor. And there is no interneuron or integration neuron. Okay, our example of this is something you see on the left side over there, the so-called knee-jerk response. Okay, very fast response right here. Also, under the number of synapses, we also have synaptic. And a polysynaptic type of response means that you've got two or more synapses, which means you also have three or more neurons. A little bit of a integration here, but our example is the withdraw from harm reflex. Just, you can see, almost kind of equivalent to what I just showed you a second ago. So anyway, that's the first way these things are characterized. Second way is by their effector. Okay? So if you have a skeletal muscle effector, this is characterized as a somatic reflex. Whereas if you have a autonomic reflex, effector, this is called visceral. So here you've got cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, or a gland. In some cases, it's going to be your responding unit. But again, this is all autonomic right here in terms of this is skeletal muscle. And then the third issue has to do with the relationship between the receptor and the effector. Basically, in terms of what side of the body each are on. Okay, and so if the receptor and the effector are on the same side of the body, it's ipsilateral. So that means, like with the knee-jerk response right here, if they're stimulating the receptor right here, your other leg doesn't kick, but it's the same leg that's being stimulated. So the receptor as well as the effector basically on the same side. Whereas what we already talked about before, most of the types of responses are so-called contralateral. And so now we have the receptor and the effector on opposite sides. All right, and so again, on this one right here, where we're talking withdraw from harm, if you're going to stab your finger down on that tack, you're probably going to use the same arm to lift it back away. So that would be ipsi. But if it was like that first picture where there's like a nail stuck in your hand, of course you can use the other hand, right, to pull that out. So that would be a contralateral condition. So anyhow, two basic examples right here. So on this side here is the one that everybody has had done to them when you go to the doctor's office for your physical. You sit up on the table, your legs are hanging, and he taps away at your tendon right here. And what that does is it activates a stretch receptor. And that's what this little like squiggly line represents. So the end of the muscle for your quad is actually down to here. And if you just barely deform it a little bit, that'll send a signal, stretch signal back to here, and that will activate this pathway. So here's our sensory coming in, but notice it's synapsing straight with the motor. So this is going to be one synapse, monosynaptic, And then we have our motor out to the same muscle that the receptor's in. So this is going to contract, and your leg is, of course, going to do that little movement, right? Right? So anyway, it's called knee jerk. Again, monosynaptic, one synapse, sensory straight to the motor. It's ipsilateral because the leg that's stimulated is also the leg that responds. And then it's somatic because we have skeletal muscle for our effectors. Okay. Over here, polysynaptic, because we have sensory coming in, but it does synapse with an interneuron integration neuron here in the cord. And so there's two synapses, integration synapses with the motor. Back out now to the body. The illustration right here is showing, again, a ipsilateral response, because as you touch that pin, you move your arm back out, away from it, right? And again, it is skeletal muscle, so that's somatic type of response. Again, the significance of this right here, nobody really sort of senses this too much, but it's the indicator of the overall responsiveness of your entire nervous system. Because if you're sitting up on that table and they're kind of tapping away at your little tendon, and your leg is moving, that means you've got good response. If they've got to really crank down on it to get you to respond, that means your sensitivity is not so high, right? For us, regularly, it's balance. That's what it's all about. You know, we never think about this, but your knee joints down there always got to kind of do this kind of stuff right here, right? You know, and the reason we're not sitting there doing this like this is because this thing here is always responding. Anytime there's a little bit of stretch right there, it causes this muscle here to kind of contract and stabilize, along with some other ones too. But it's basically an equilibrium type of response. And the thing about equilibrium is, generally speaking, when you're about to lose equilibrium, there's not a lot of time for integration. There's not a lot of time for analysis. It's just got to happen right away, so you don't what? Fall over. Get that? Right? You know, so it's quick. So it's monosynaptic. Okay? Ipsilateral, because again, it's one side or the other that is actually typically moving, but if both sides are moving, you get them both on the same side, or both sides responding. And then it is skeletal. All right, here's another withdraw from harm deal. So again, you're about to grab onto a hot metal pan. You've got temperature receptors, of course, that will really typically detect that before you actually touch it, usually. But again, it is polysynaptic, because we do have two synapses in this case. And then from here we come down, and again, this is showing ipsilateral because we're removing the same hand that's being endangered right here. And again, you're using skeletal muscle to do that, so it is somatic. All right, then the last one is a little more complicated. So one of the things about stepping on a tack right here with your foot is that you just can't hop straight up in the air and remove your foot, right, from the source of the danger, but really you have to actually activate your other leg to kind of hold you up while you move your foot. I mean, you could technically jump up in the air. But anyway, as you do, again, step on the tack, then you have your sensory neuron